And thank you so much for the kind invitation and for giving me the opportunity to present my research here at TTU's Global Ethics Day. My name is Woersdoerfer. I got my PhD in business ethics, thank you very much, from Goethe University Frankfurt, and I'm now an instructor at the Murdoch Center for Engineering Professionalism. And my current research interests include computer ethics, environmental ethics, and the business and human rights debate. Today I'm going to present my latest research in the field of political CSR, corporate social responsibility, and the business and human rights debate. And I'm particularly focusing on the Equator Principles framework, which is one of the most important CSR initiatives in the finance industry. The EPs are officially described as a voluntary and self-regulatory finance industry benchmark, and in particular as a credit risk management framework for determining, assessing, and managing environmental and social risk in project finance transactions. The EPs are based on the International Finance Corporation's performance standards on environmental and social sustainability, as well as the World Bank Group's environmental health and safety guidelines. As of today, 84 financial institutions have adopted this CSR initiative, and the EPs cover around 70 to 80% of international project finance debt in emerging markets and developing countries. In 2013, the Equator Principles Association celebrated the 10th anniversary of the Equator Principles framework, and at the same time, the formal launch of the third and latest generation of these principles. And there are two major innovations when it comes to EP3, the latest generation of these principles. First one is the EPs aim at environmental stewardship or sustainability, which means they try to tackle climate change and global warming, mainly by reducing CO2 emissions during the design, construction, operation of these projects, and by evaluating less greenhouse gas intensive technologies and procedures. The second innovative element refers to the explicit acknowledgement and inclusion of John Ruggie's Protect, Respect, and Remedy framework, which forms the basis for the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights. In this sense, the Equator Principles aim at social sustainability, which means they mainly try to foster respect for the rights of project-affected communities in general and indigenous communities in particular. And here the EPs require the following requirement, which means that the EPs, or every project that is financed under the EPs, requires a stakeholder engagement process or a stakeholder dialogue process, which means that indigenous communities and project-affected communities in general have to be informed about the potential environmental and social risks and impacts that are associated with a respective project. The main problem with the Equator Principles, including the latest version, is the limited impact, and some might say their practical failure in reality. And this is mainly due to a lack of enforcement, monitoring, and sanctioning mechanisms, and a lack of adequate governance systems in general. Many Equator Principles financial institutions still engage in so-called dirty projects or dodgy deals, that is, projects which have egregious impacts on the environment and project-affected communities. A further problem, as I see it, is that the Equator Principles, as well as the underlying John Ruggie framework, the Protect, Respect, and Remedy framework, have to be labeled as a mainly negative and impact-based concept of CSR, one which stands in contrast to a positive and leverage-based concept of CSR. And according to the Equator Principles and the underlying Ruggie framework, states and not companies are considered to be the primary and exclusive human rights duty bearers and trustees, which means that any positive duty to protect and realize human rights is part of the exclusive domain of nation states. Companies, on the other hand, only need to fulfill the negative duty to do no harm and the negative duty to respect human rights. If they want to engage in the positive duties to protect and realize human rights, they can do so, but this is regarded as an optional and voluntary matter of corporate philanthropy. In my paper, I argue against this human rights minimalism, as I call it, and this bias towards corporate voluntarism, and I argue for a gradual transition from this negative and impact-based concept of CSR towards a positive and leverage-based concept of CSR. And in particular, I argue for a move towards more mandatory and legally binding human rights obligations for multinational companies in general and financial institutions in particular. Why financial institutions? What is so special about financial institutions and banks in the context of human rights, but also in the context of climate change? Well, financial institutions are right at the center of the global political economy. They link the financial sector, the Wall Street, with the real economy, the so-called Main Street. And they are powerful actors in this global political economy in the sense that they equal economic powerhouses and pacemakers that keep the economic blood circulation alive. And by providing financial means, either in the form of bonds, shares, and loans, they have a huge leverage influence over their clients and their business partners. Banks in particular are those institutions that co-determine whether or not financial resources are used in an ethical and sustainable manner. And they are key actors in this transitional process towards an ethical and green economy. And by voting with their money, they ideally help to catalyze this process towards economic, social, and environmental sustainability. Equator banks, or Equator Principles financial institutions in particular, have a huge leverage influence over their clients, not only prior to deal approval, but also over the life of the loan. And the reason for this is that they closely collaborate with their clients in order to set up and work out environmental and social risk assessments, impact assessment systems, management systems, and action plans. And this means that banks have a huge ability, a huge influence leverage over their clients, and they really are able to shape their clients' behavior on the ground. One way to exert leverage influence could be by making use of so-called covenants, which means that through their contractual business relationships, banks could easily include environmental, social, and human rights requirements or human rights clauses into their supply and value chain management system. And these human rights clauses could include explicit references, for example, to stakeholder engagement, to project-level grievance mechanisms, and impact benefit agreements. A further way to exert leverage influence could be by making use of so-called divestment strategies, which means that banks and other financial institutions should clearly communicate to their clients that they will divest and disengage from companies that constantly violate environmental, social, and human rights standards. In other words, in order to avoid being complicit, banks and financial institutions should clearly communicate that they will terminate all direct and indirect business relationships to their clients that are notorious for their detrimental and negative business practices. Other ways or other means of corporate human rights advocacy or activism, as I call it, include speaking out against ongoing, systematic, and severe human rights violations, engaging in public human rights discourses, but also collaborating closely with NGOs and civil society organizations, or simply to make use of political power and authority and the diplomatic channels that banks and other multinational companies have available. And in this sense, in this regard, they could, for example, put pressure on perpetrators and abusive and authoritarian governments and threaten them with withdrawing their financial means from countries or from companies that are notorious for their detrimental and negative human rights impacts. Some researchers in the field of business and human rights have claimed that there's already a cultural change on its way in the finance industry. But recent research conducted by finance NGOs, but also by my colleagues and myself, has shown that most multinational banks, most multinational financial institutions show serious deficiencies in terms of the human rights agenda and in terms of the human rights policy. And this isn't particularly true for setting up adequate stakeholder engagement, dialogue processes, or project-level grievance mechanisms. But there's still hope in the form that there are some pioneering companies out there, especially in the Netherlands, that could function as role models and could indicate this way towards a positive and leveraged concept of CSR. But the question remains whether these pioneering companies will remain niche players or whether they will be able to initiate a race to the top. Thank you very much.